Hello, welcome to Learn It from Layman. My name is Carl Christensen. I'm back again with Matthew Christensen, Tim Cox, and we have a special guest today, as we are occasionally want to do. This time we've invited, of course, our father. Well, not all of our fathers. Tim can't claim that distinction. Sorry, Tim.
I'm happy with Uncle. That's a nice title too.
Yeah, we figure with all the nepotism going around in the world these days, we might as well start with our dad, who we're going to discuss today a little bit about college, about writing in general, writing, publishing, becoming an author, and so let me give a little introduction. So Bryce Christensen, doctorate in is it just English, Dad, or
English literature?
English literature. Okay, doctorate in English literature from Marquette. A number of former jobs. Currently professor at Southern Utah University. Been there for, what is it now, 15 years?
Like 20 years.
20 years. Okay. And
almost.
Yeah. And then let's see, author of what? 4 or 5 published books.
Yeah.
Something like that. And then a number of poems, and so that establishes your credibility there, Dad, I think. So you've been teaching, besides the 20 years at SUU, you've taught second language learners and high school chemistry, which is not related to this podcast, but useful. So let's start a little bit talking about writing and what makes a good writer, a good author. I guess specifically. So let's start with a little bit with what you do right now when you teach students. What are some of the issues you see in people as in students as they're writing, in any type of writing, essentially? What are some common mistakes you see?
Well, you say any type of writing. Students need to recognize writing is not one thing. The kind of writing that you do to a friend to explain what happened to you this weekend is a very different kind of writing than you do when you're analyzing a book or analyzing a movie, or and even those two. You might actually, in a letter to a friend, analyze a book or movie, but it will be a different kind of analysis than you would do for a class, a university class. Audience and purpose affect writing. Students don't always understand that. If you know who is going to be reading what you write and why they're going to be reading it, then you have a better what we call rhetorical posture. The rhetorical posture is defined by your sense of audience, your sense of purpose. Now, part of the problem with students is the only reason they're writing is because they have this requirement to satisfy to get their degree. They don't really want to write. They really don't have a genuine sense of audience. They just want to get this out of the way, this requirement. Students start to write well when they have a sense of audience, and they actually do want to connect with that audience. Some years ago, when I was teaching at Rockford College, which is now Rockford University in Illinois, I had a student who had trained me like a Pavlovian dog to shudder when I saw his name at the top of it. This is back when all of the essays were hard copy. When I saw his name at the top of an essay, I knew it was going to be bad. And I would shove it to the bottom, his essay to the bottom of the stack, hoping that just maybe the world would end before I got there. But late in the semester, he submitted an essay in which he was personally invested. He had something. He had a sense of audience. He had a sense of purpose. I'm not sure I agreed with it. He was apparently very much a basketball fan, and I was doing something on persuading some and he was arguing. I think his thesis was dubious, but he did it with some passion. He was arguing that Charles Barkley, this is again decades ago, Charles Barkley is a better basketball player than Michael Jordan.
All right.
And
that was well written.
I thought his argument put too much emphasis on rebounding. But what set this essay apart, made it worlds better than anything he'd written, is he was invested. He wanted to persuade you. He had found statistics that, as they said, I thought he was overemphasizing rebounding, but he knew what he wanted to do. This wasn't just an academic exercise. He was invested in it. He wanted to persuade you that Charles Barkley was a better basketball player than Michael Jordan. And that made his writing so much. I mean, previously, I had been painfully aware, as I read his essays, is that he didn't want to write it. And I surely didn't want to read it, because when you have a clear sense of audience, you have a clear sense of purpose, suddenly your writing starts to cohere. It takes it takes a clear form. The biggest problem with students is they don't have a clear sense of audience. They don't have a clear sense of purpose. But their sense of purpose is, let's get this stupid thing out of the way.
Right.
And that is not a sense of purpose that will yield a good, persuasive, cogent essay.
Okay, so that makes sense. And though, I guess so my follow-up question would be, okay, so I know in let's say take journalism, for example, there are things that as a good journalist, even if you know what you're trying to report on, you're trying to that just because you know who you're trying to speak to, you just know because you know your purpose, there are still good journalistic practices that you need to employ in order to write a good article. Is that the case in writing then as well? So independent of journalism, in writing, even if you know your purpose and you know your audience, there are still particular things that you need to incorporate in good writing.
Well, yeah, it's still, I just have a hard time thinking of writing as one thing. If you're doing technical writing, that's one. If you're doing, there is a kind of writing which is expressing what's in your heart. I read not too long ago. It's a book, you can look it up. It's the University of Virginia Press book titled "Reading Through the Night" by Jane Tompkins, who's a literary scholar, and it's a remarkable book in which Professor Tompkins, now an emeritus professor, recounts how after she had retired, she discovered how much books can illuminate your personal emotional circumstances. She acknowledges in the book that and she had a successful career as a professor of literature, but her approach had been very cerebral, analyzing things intellectually, very little connection with the emotional valence of works. And now, and the title of her book, Reading Through the Night, and suddenly she recognized that literature, and how she got through a career in literature without being aware of this, puzzles me, to put it mildly. But suddenly, literature was not simply a cerebral exploration; it was an emotional engagement. And if you're writing from the heart, if you're and you're expressing yourself, that's a different kind of writing. I actually have students do personal response essays to responding to literature, because literature does carry an emotional valence. But then we do, and I have to emphasize that when we do an analytical essay about an essay, I don't want to know about their personal experience. I do not want to know about their personal feelings. I want them to analyze the character development, or the setting, or the theme, and the vertical pronoun can disappear because I don't want to know about. So personal expression can be a very legitimate form of writing, but it's quite different from the objective analytical mode of writing. So that what makes good writing? Well, writing is not one thing. And so good writing is not one thing. It is what will. There is one thing which I think is fairly universal. Writing is serving your readers. You should be the servant of your readers. If your readers complete your essay, your poem, your novel, whatever it is you've written, and they feel well served, they feel well satisfied, you've done your job as a writer. If you meet and satisfy the expectations of your readers, that's what writing is about. But of course, that requires you to reflect on reader expectations. In the situation you find yourself, so what you're doing, what will readers expect? And then you set about satisfying reader expectations.
Okay. So, as this podcast is a Learn It from a Layman podcast, we won't go too deep further into that subject. We try to, keep things nice and in as much as you can. Though we did recently do rocket science, so some might argue that this podcast is just a misnomer. But I thought we'd talk a little bit about the building blocks of writing then. So a little bit about various writing techniques. Some people are very familiar with, but like similes, metaphors, those are, I think, most people are familiar with. But maybe we talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Because similes, metaphors are those are relevant in poetry, much less relevant in prose, and which is non-poetry. Expository writing is one form of prose. It's maybe the form of writing which matters most for many people in professional settings. Expository writing means explanatory writing that exposes to view relevant issues. Actually, when things like metaphor can actually slow the reader down, because metaphor requires reflection, contemplation, and sometimes metaphors can be rather opaque. In a letter that he sent to a friend, it's remarkable that he kept any friends. William Blake, the 18th century poet, was responding to his friend's complaint that his poetry was difficult to understand. And Blake responded, "I cannot make all things plain to an idiot."
We should make a shirt that says that.
and if you're a towering imagination, Blake was a genius, also a madman, but Blake, he could do that. And his poetry is not a quick, easy read. But for most expository reading, the objective is to make as many things plain to as many idiots as possible. You want to level things out, which means you're not going to do too much with metaphor. You might, if the metaphor is easily, of course, the easiest, simplest metaphors are cliched metaphors. They cease to have much, like dead as a doornail. Began as a metaphor. It's now a pretty flat one. It doesn't really have much imaginative vigor, because it probably had some imaginative vigor when it was first coined, but when metaphors age and they become used widely, they lose their force. But you don't need to use metaphors, and probably not well advised to use too much in the way of metaphors when you're writing expository writing.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. I do wonder. So I know, let's say for example, any type of writing, you don't want to do sentence fragments, right?
Well, you say any type. For most professional writing, you're absolutely correct. But in certain some kinds of creative, I've just been teaching some of my students at a National Taiwan University. We've just been doing Huckleberry Finn, and that novel is told from the perspective of an uneducated adolescent boy, and his speech, which is right. I mean, we're hearing the novel from the mouth, as it were, from the mouth of this uneducated teenage boy, is full of sentence fragments and non-standard verb forms and all kinds of the. I tell my students who almost all of whom speak Mandarin Chinese as a first language, and English is their second language. Their mastery of their second language is impressive, but still, so you've spent a lot of time learning the standard form of the English language. Now we're going to read a novel where that standard form is thrown out the window. We have an uneducated adolescent boy telling the story, and he violates the expectations of those who've learned standard English again in the end. And it works. It's part of the genius of the novel. Part of the genius of the novel is we come to really believe. We can really believe we're listening to this uneducated boy. So for creative, but for most professional writing, you want to conform to the rules of standard English. That would mean no sentence fragments. It would mean that your subjects always agree with your verbs, that you use the right verb forms for subjunctive and imperative. It would mean that you use correct case form and pronouns and so on. All those things you do if you're. It's sort of like, and I use this metaphor with my students. I said, if you're going for a job interview, you dress up, and you don't wear a tuxedo, but you groom yourself and you dress professionally. You dress professionally. If you're doing an essay for a professional forum or an academic forum, you, as it were, dress up. You make sure that all of your, if you use an incorrect pronoun, if you, for example, if you say him arriving early surprised me, now that's a non-standard pronoun form because gerunds take possessives. If you say that in casual conversation and your friend corrects you, you need a new friend.
Tim,
I would never correct that.
But if you use the wrong pronoun form in formal writing, and someone's and your copy editor doesn't catch that, you need a new copy editor. What really writing in professional forums and in serious academic forums is really a different form of the language. It's not. It overlaps with the spoken language, but it's not the same. It's the rules we expect professional writers to follow, academic writers to follow, are those rules we often relax or even disregard in casual speech. I have to say that I have not been pleased by the bleed over effect of texting, because texting is a mongrel form of writing which shreds the normal rules for diction, orthography, punctuation, and I see that the malign influence of texting in student writing. It's not it's not a beneficent influence.
Saying
Right.
that would be an LOL.
Yeah.
As an explanatory aside, I realized at the beginning, I don't think I explained to our audience that currently you are not at SUU. You are at the University of Taiwan in Taipei, as what you were a full
National Taiwan University.
National Taiwan University. Sorry,
NTU.
NTU, and you were there as a Fulbright scholar because of the whole coronavirus insanity. The Fulbright pulled all of their professors out, giving them the option to stay if they wanted to. And so you are currently not a Fulbright scholar, but you are still a visiting professor at whatever it is.
TIDOC is what they call it here. National Taiwan University. Yes.
That's the one.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the explanation as why all of your students speak Mandarin. I bet our audience might have been wondering why all students of SUU speak Mandarin. So,
All right.
Prerequisite.
It's not the case. Right. So, okay. So back on, you said there are certain things that you need to conform to if you're doing essentially professional writing of almost any type. You said, other than creative, you want to make sure that you adhere to a particular set of basic rules. What do you in writing? Do you teach those things at college level, or do you just assume that your students already know what they need to not use in professional writing?
And we're still talking. I don't know that we ever addressed it. Did you want to talk about what those basic writing building blocks are?
Well,
sentence. You want right? I mean, Dad talked about it a little bit, right? So, no sentence fragments. You want to make sure that your verbs are conjugated correctly. Those type, There
are and there are real rules, and then there are phony rules. And phony rules, the real rules are the ones which you see observed and followed in well-edited magazines, journals, books. They are the linguistic habits of the educated, the linguistic habits of the professional gatekeepers. And they change over time. They change over some, the who-whom distinction, which I honor and follow. I had a friend at Rockford College who said, because I get exercised over things such as this, the who-whom distinction. And John said, just wait a century and the whole issue will be gone. And he's probably right, because that distinction is fading, which grieves me, saddens me, because I think you communicate valuable syntactic information by getting the case form right. But the rules are those that editors and gatekeepers observe. But there are some phony rules out there, like you can't begin a sentence with a conjunction like and or but. And my students, I say, now, how many of you taught this in high school? And most of them are taught that, and it's a bogus rule. It's a completely bogus rule. Well, how do we know it's a bogus rule? Because you pick up books from university presses, you pick up high-level journals like Atlantic Monthly or Harper's, and you see writers doing it. And the writers do it, their editors let them do it. And as I said, the real rules don't get past the gatekeepers. I mean, they're enforced by the gatekeepers. That's a bogus rule. Some again, another bogus rule. Some students have been taught by high school, and I understand high school teachers. They because a sentence that begins with a conjunction might actually not be a sentence. It might be a sentence fragment, and there's this bogus rule: you can't begin a sentence with the word because. Well, that's a bogus rule too. But I understand why a sentence that begins with because and doesn't have an independent clause to connect to it is a sentence fragment. But we have these bogus rules. There's an excellent book. Let me plug this book on this podcast, and that is Style. By Style, subtitle 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace. The early editions were by Joseph Williams. He's taken on a co-author whose name I don't remember, but the early editions I think are just, I'm not persuaded that the later editions are any better. And you can get it Amazon.com used books. You'll probably pay more for the shipping than for the book because it's a widely used book, and for some reason some students are willing to part with their copy after their classes. I keep my copy under my pillow. It's a wonderful book, and he talks about real rules and these bogus or faux rules, these rules that aren't legitimate rules. Do I teach my students? Obviously, I do teach my students some of the rules, and I also unburden them. I take from their backs the weight of bogus rules, rules that they need not observe. I'm the only grammar teacher I'm the only one who teaches a class entirely devoted to grammar at Southern Utah University. I'll be teaching it this coming fall. And grammar is not punctuation, but it affects punctuation. Grammar is not writing, but it affects writing. And so we talk about things like comma splices and how an understanding of clause boundaries, and you can't recognize clause boundaries unless you know the grammar of clauses, can help you to punctuate correctly. So I do teach some grammar, and I said grammar is not punctuation, but if you understand grammar, you're much more likely to get the punctuation right.
Okay, so as far as I guess moving on from the building blocks of language then and writing and what might be useful to know at the college level for writing, I think some of the other questions we wanted to touch on, or at least I would like to touch on, are a lot of people, aspiring authors, aspiring writers, want to know what it takes to get published. And obviously the answer for that is different depending on the genre that you're trying to get published. But obviously, whether you're trying to get a novel published or a non-fiction book or a poem or a research paper or something like that. So I guess let's try to knock these off one at a time. I know a lot of people are interested in writing their own novel. You've published one, working on publishing your second novel. Any words of advice or steps that someone needs to go through to publish a novel?
Are you saying someone to pay for your novel, or you pay to get your novel published? Because Amazon will publish anything for you if you give them like a couple $100.
Well, self-publishing is essentially free, but I mean like the traditional publishing route.
Right. And the publishing can be very challenging, very daunting. It can take you much longer to find a publisher than it takes to write your novel, and you may never find a publisher. It's a challenge. There are of course the vanity press that you pay but that's just your money if you want to do it. And occasionally books published that way actually then find a significant audience. So I'm not going to say that's always a bad thing. But it's better if you can find a publisher who will take the burden, take the risk, and also take the task of marketing from you. But it is a real challenge. The best thing to do is research. Look at what you've written or what you're in the process of writing. What is it like? What is it like, and who's publishing it? Do some kind of comparison that and find out what publishers have published the kind of thing that you're writing, and then now some of the best publishers won't even talk to authors. They only talk to literary agents, and so you have to try to find an agent, and that can be difficult because agents make their money by placing manuscripts. They will be quite selective what manuscripts they take on. So just finding an agent can be a challenge. I have not published enough. And when you talk about a novel, I haven't published that much as a creative writer, and I've actually done more with standalone poems than with book-length work. So I'm not sure I'm the best source on that. I do know kind of what's involved. I know my first novel, it was really hard to find a publisher. I was delighted when I finally found one. The second one, I've got a better publisher, and the process was easier, maybe because I already had one novel on the resume. But finding a publisher is done. I have a colleague at Southern Utah University who teaches creative writing for fiction writers, and he says finding a publisher is like winning the lottery.
Right. So I do think what you mentioned has to be somewhat important and something useful for inspiring authors to know. You said you had a novel. Your first novel was more difficult to get published than your second novel, and you also have other works of that you've had published in the past. So you have some previous experience that you can put on a letter that you send to the publisher. So
right, and that helps.
So essentially, if you want to get a novel published, it might help to have. I mean, I know also in this social media era, if you have a social media following, I'm sure that would also help you get published. So there are other things that you can bring in to bear when trying to get your novel published, right?
I'm sure. Yeah, if you're just breaking in, it's hard. I mean, because publishers look for a track record, and how do you get a track record if you're just breaking in? So breaking in can be really tough.
Right. Okay. As far as poetry, you said you've mentioned you published a large number at this point of poems, even a book or two of poetry. So what was the process? What is the process to get a poem published?
I've been in the last couple of years. Most of the poems I've published have been by request from venues.
I don't think most people don't get requests.
But that takes getting to a certain point. But again, what kind of poetry do you write? Who's publishing that kind of poetry? Look at what you do. Try to come up with a match between if you do. I do mostly formal poetry. I do sonnets, particularly. Do metrical rhyming poetry. There are many venues that won't even look at that kind of poetry. And so you have to establish who will publish that kind of writing. The and so do your research. Do your research on the editorial expectations of the venue you're going to send your poems to.
Right. That makes sense. How do you okay, so let's talk a little bit about, so you've worked for a long time, and another thing in your short biography I gave at the beginning of the podcast, that you've been a book reviewer for Booklist.
Correct.
So for the laymen out there that are listening to our podcast, can you explain what Booklist is and what you've done for them?
Booklist is a review journal for American libraries. It is the review publication for the American Library Association, and they publish short reviews of new books. And I have reviewed books in literature, in science, in language history, in the topics such as that, religion, and for me, it's been an education to review the books, and I've been able to then turn some of the things I've learned by reviewing these books actually into some of my own writing. But yes, these are not full-blown book reviews; they're just short summary reviews. But I've benefited a great deal from the experience of doing those reviews for 30 years.
Yeah, that's a lot of reading, I believe.
Yes.
So I have some other questions, but there are a couple I wanted to kind of touch on before we wrapped up the podcast. But before I do so, I don't know if Matt or Tim or Cameron had any questions that they wanted to touch as far as just generic writing questions that we could discuss.
Yeah, I got one. As you, if you're sitting out there, as we all are, thinking, I want to be a famous author someday, but I just don't know what to write, what are some recommendations that you could give to an aspiring writer in terms of just how to figure out what to write about, how to get an idea, how to get an inspiration, what types of things work for you, and what types of things would you recommend people attempt in order to figure out what to write?
Well, I'm not a famous author, so I'm not sure I'm the best.
Well, we're not a famous podcast, but that doesn't stop us from talking like it.
There's I think of he's a poet, a wonderful poet. I recommend his work, Howard Nemerov, who said, "Write about what you know. That will leave you with a lot of spare time." And to go to his own work, for example, one of his famous poems, and it's a very moving poem. I wish I could quote it from memory. Entitled "A War in the Air," and it's a very moving poem about something he knew very well from the inside. He's been deceased now for a number of years, but the War in the Air is about his experience in the Army Air Force in World War II. And he knew that, and the poem conveys his sense of emotional knowledge, that this is not, and so write what you know. Write what you know. I've just been teaching Willa Cather, a wonderful American novelist, who said that her writing career really began when she just started to remember, and she was writing about what she knew as a young girl growing up on the plains of Nebraska, and her so-called Prairie Trilogy grows out of her deep personal knowledge of that world. Write what you know. Write what you know, and as Howard Numeroff says, I love his little sort of snarky add-on. Write what you know. That will leave you with a lot of spare time.
I think for the layman, the danger there is they don't know anything. So it's not.
But
it kind of makes you wonder about the sci-fi and fantasy authors. You know,
that's right.
I have to share that Joseph Epstein, a wonderful scholar. He was the editor of the American Scholar for many years. But he wrote an essay a couple of years ago entitled "The Bookish Life," and he talked about all his reading. And he talked about all the books, and he's getting on in years now. He talked about all the books he still wanted to read, most of them ancient Greek and ancient Roman texts, things he still wanted to read. And acknowledging his advanced years, he said, obviously, some of this reading will have to happen after I've passed on. But he said, I'm confident that heaven will have a large and well-stocked library. Then he added in a sort of snarky fashion, hell will have a large library too, but it will contain only science fiction and fantasy.
Well, that's just offended a large portion of the people listening. So
there goes the Harry Potter fans amongst our audience. That's okay.
Okay.
Although I will point out, one of the high fantasy authors, J.R.R. Tolkien, allegedly based a lot of the Lord of the Rings trilogy on his own personal experiences, even including his experiences in World War I. So, when you say write what you know, it doesn't need to be, there's a liberty or a license there, I guess, that you can take. You have flexibility in how you frame what you know.
Right. And I think the emotional, imaginative depth of what Tolkien did allowed him to break through some of the critical bias against fantasy writing, because his fantasy is of an order that most fantasy writers cannot deliver.
So along those lines, as we get close to wrapping up the podcast, you've read a lot of books, as we mentioned before, with book lists, and then obviously being an English professor and generally spending a lot of time reading. Now months ago, it was last year, we had a short podcast where we discussed classic books that we enjoyed, but I think that was just Cameron and myself on that. What books from you, I guess, two perspectives. Subjectively, what books do you think everyone should read? And then objectively, as a English professor, what books should everyone read? So from both points of view, I guess your favorite books, and then objectively, what are books that people should read as a human?
Yeah, there used to be, and there was a great the poet and critic T.S. Eliot said it doesn't. I mean, he overstates this, but there's still some value in what he said. It doesn't matter what books people read, but they should all read the same ones. It used to be you could assume that educated speakers of English had read the King James Bible, had read the major plays of Shakespeare, had read Milton, had read Pilgrim's Progress. You used to be able to assume a knowledge of those things, and probably you could add Chaucer to that list. You could assume a knowledge of these canonical authors, these canonical works. And it's much harder to assume that anymore. We were reading an essay by Charles Lamb, the early 19th century essayist, and he makes a facetious allusion, a playful allusion about the lilies of the field. And I asked myself, okay, what's the allusion here? What's the passing reference here? And maybe it was too early in the morning or something. None of my students seemed, and they didn't even give me Sidney Poitier. They gave. I mean, this is a reference to the most famous sermon in Christian thought, the Sermon on the Mount. It's a playful, a facetious allusion, but it's still an allusion. So that list I just gave you, the Bible, the major plays of Shakespeare, Milton, Pilgrim's Progress, probably put Chaucer on that list. These are works that just everyone should read, so that we share a kind of literary knowledge that can deepen our discourse. When we talk together and we can refer to shared texts. I would say, add a few things in translation. I would say Dante's Commedia, his Divine Comedy.
So most people just read the Inferno, right?
Yeah, that's which is unfortunate. But okay, if you only have to read one, if you're only going to read one part, it'll probably be the Inferno. Though the Purgatorio and the Paradiso are also wonderful. And of course, I have personal favorites. I'm a great fan of Dostoevsky, whom I confess I have to read in translation. I'm a great fan of the poetry of some great Chinese poets like Du Fu, Li Bai, Bai Zhui, and which I read in translation. But I have some nonfiction books that I think are deserving of attention. I'll just mention one. I can recommend short books with a clear conscience because I'm not burdening Peter Medawar, The Limits of Science. Peter Medawar is a Nobel laureate in medicine, and his philosophical reflections on the limits of science, I think, is very rewarding. That's a personal favorite. It's not, it's not on the list with Shakespeare and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But I would say, and go back to writing, to be a good writer, become a voracious reader, because that will stock you. It will expose you to models of good writing. It will furnish your imagination with resources for writing. And read. David Mikix has an excellent book out titled "Slow Reading in a Hurried Age." And obviously, it's a book. The title doesn't say it all, but the title does signal much of what he has to say. By slow reading, he means reflective reading, meditative reading, the kind of reading that literature invites us to do. You don't want. I mean, you have to be some kind of fool to speed read Shakespeare, to speed read Milton, to speed read Wordsworth, or even the great writers of fiction. You don't want to speed read Dostoevsky or Dickens or
Harry
Thackeray.
Potter.
I didn't say
that. Just bringing up to a modern canon.
Yeah. Anyway, but read. If you want to be a good writer, read a lot, and read those. There's a John Ciardi talks about horizontal audiences and vertical audiences. Horizontal audiences are those the audience contemporary to the author. Vertical audiences are the audiences that the author attracts across time, across generations. There is a reason that we're still reading Sophocles and Aeschylus thousands of years after their death, and that there's We're still reading the Beowulf poet, whose name we will never know, but the Beowulf poet or William Langland, or anyway, you're reading. Don't just become a captive of our age, because our age doesn't know everything. In fact, our age knows less than it thinks it knows. Visit earlier times. There's a reason that we're still reading Shakespeare. We're still reading Marlowe. We're still reading Ben Jonson. The earlier ages have something to teach, not just about specific questions and concerns, but about the nature of writing too. So anyway.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. Having grown up in your house, we are familiar with many of those, though I will confess myself a layman on a few of those authors still. So as we wrap up this podcast, go ahead and go grab Milton and Chaucer and sit down for a good long read. So thank you, Dad, Bryce.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.